Queen Elizabeth I was more than just a queen. She was a legend, a figure whose image, crafted with meticulous care, transcended her reign to become an icon of power, beauty, and untouchable royalty. From the moment she ascended the throne in 1558, Elizabeth was fully aware of her position. She was not merely the ruler of England, she was a symbol, an embodiment of divine authority and unmatched grace. Everything about her, from her elaborate gowns to the way she held herself in court, was a carefully curated performance. Behind the scenes, however, she was also a woman gripped by fear, obsession, and vanity. Her image was the key to her power, and she would go to extraordinary lengths to protect it. In her time, the idea of cleanliness wasn't about hygiene or health. It was about the appearance of purity and perfection. To maintain her royal dignity, Elizabeth avoided the ordinary customs of cleanliness. Her hygiene was an intricate dance, a public performance designed to preserve her myth, to keep her untouchable. Behind her majestic gowns and regal bearing was a woman who feared aging, who feared the passage of time more than anything else. She wasn't just trying to stay clean, she was trying to stop time itself, to preserve her image as the untarnished Virgin Queen. Elizabeth's obsession with her appearance became a defining trait of her reign. She shunned the simple comforts of bathing, fearing it would expose her to illness and the natural human condition of aging. Instead, she created a world of illusion, where every scent, every layer of fabric, and every touch of makeup worked to hide the truth of her deteriorating body. What we know of her hygiene rituals is not a story of vanity alone, but a tale of a queen whose image was everything, and whose body became a battleground between the myths she created and the reality she could never escape. As we take a closer look at the bizarre and often shocking lengths Elizabeth went to in order to keep up the appearance of youth and cleanliness, we will uncover a woman consumed by the need to preserve her power not just as a monarch, but as a living legend. The truth behind her hygiene is more than just strange. It is a reflection of her deepest fears, her anxieties, and her refusal to show weakness to the world. Her image, in the end, became her only form of cleanliness. This opening part establishes the tone and sets the stage for the detailed exploration of Queen Elizabeth I's unique approach to cleanliness. It frames her image as a performance, highlighting the tension between the public persona she worked tirelessly to maintain and the personal insecurities that drove her strange and extreme hygiene practices. This sets up the unfolding story of a queen who wielded her image as her greatest weapon, even at the cost of her health. Queen Elizabeth I's identity as the Virgin Queen was not just a political tool, it was the very foundation of her reign. The title was a symbol of purity, power, and divine favor, a deliberate and strategic choice that set her apart from all other monarchs. In an age where royal legitimacy was often secured through marriage, Elizabeth chose to remain unmarried, presenting herself as both the ruler and the embodiment of England itself. To her people, she was a figure of divine will, untouched by the frailties of mortal life. Her virginity was an image that had to be preserved, not just for political reasons, but to keep her power and position intact. Elizabeth's refusal to marry was seen as a bold statement of independence, but it was also part of a carefully constructed public persona. Every action, every word, and every piece of clothing she wore was designed to reinforce this image of the untouchable, unyielding monarch. She dressed in elaborate gowns adorned with jewels, each piece meant to symbolize wealth, grace, and divine approval. Her court was a reflection of her status, rich, vibrant, and full of grandeur. The performances she staged within it reinforced her image as an eternal queen, ageless and powerful. But it wasn't just about outward appearances. Elizabeth understood the power of symbolism in everything she did. Her public speeches were filled with references to her virginity, carefully crafted to reinforce the idea that her relationship with England was sacred and untainted by the bonds of marriage. She became a living symbol of England's power and unity, untarnished by the typical dynamics of royal politics. Her virginity, her self-imposed celibacy, became a central tenet of her rule, making her a unique figure in a world where monarchs were often defined by their marriages. Behind the glimmering jewels and regal gowns, however, lay the truth. Elizabeth's obsession with maintaining this image was exhausting and all-consuming. She had to preserve not only the physical facade of a virgin queen, but the very perception that she was untouchable, above the frailties of age, illness, and decay. The image of the Virgin Queen was a mask, one she wore with pride, but also with a deep, underlying fear of what would happen if that mask ever slipped. In the royal courts of Elizabethan England, appearances were everything. The Queen's image had to remain impeccable, and she employed every tool at her disposal to ensure that it did. Her personal hygiene rituals, no matter how strange, were part of this vast performance. For Elizabeth, the image of perfection was not just about power, it was a survival mechanism. She had to be the perfect queen, a symbol of eternal youth and divine strength. And the path she took to maintain that image would lead to some of the strangest and most shocking decisions in history. This part delves into Elizabeth's calculated efforts to craft and maintain the image of the Virgin Queen, emphasizing the role her virginity played in both her personal and political life. It sets the stage for understanding her later, more extreme hygiene practices as extensions of this need to preserve an untarnished image of power and purity. As Queen Elizabeth I navigated her reign, her greatest fear was not the threat of invasion or rebellion, but the relentless march of time. The fear of aging, of losing her beauty and power, became an obsession that shaped many of her decisions, particularly when it came to her personal hygiene and appearance. In an era where a monarch's physical appearance was inextricably tied to their authority, Elizabeth understood that growing old would strip her of the divine aura she had worked so hard to cultivate. Her fear was not unfounded. In the eyes of her subjects, the Queen was a living representation of England itself. To age to show signs of vulnerability would undermine that carefully constructed image. It was a delicate balancing act. While her courtiers admired her strength, intelligence, and political savvy, Elizabeth's vanity ran deep. To appear anything less than flawless would threaten her reign. In her mind, aging was not just a personal affliction, it was a political threat. Her fear of aging manifested in various ways. One of the most striking was her refusal to bathe in water, a common practice in Elizabeth's time. In the 1500s, bathing was believed to be both a health practice and a form of personal care. However, many people, including the Queen, associated water with danger, particularly the threat of illness. At the time, it was widely believed that water could weaken the body, let in harmful miasmas, and cause disease. Elizabeth, ever cautious, feared that exposing her body to water would make her sick and hasten the signs of aging. Instead of bathing, she relied on changing her linen shifts multiple times a day. The idea was that clean, fresh fabric could pull toxins, dirt, and sweat away from the skin without the need for water. The fabric acted as a barrier, keeping her skin clean while maintaining the illusion of youth and vitality. Rose water, vinegar, and herbal infusions, all carefully concocted by her royal apothecaries, were used to dab her skin, giving her the appearance of cleanliness without the risk of water touching her. This routine was more about the maintenance of an image than actual hygiene. Elizabeth's body under her care became more of a sacred object than a human one. It was treated with reverence, and every action surrounding it was part of a larger performance. She would be dressed by her servants, who helped her change into her fresh linens, and would delicately dab her skin with fragrant waters. This was not just a cleansing ritual. It was a calculated effort to preserve the flawless image of the queen, to protect her from the ravages of time and the realities of human existence. Her refusal to bathe was also a statement. She was above the ordinary, above the common fears and practices of her people. Her beauty and cleanliness, it seemed, were sacred and untouchable. Her court followed her example, and it became a symbol of status and grandeur to partake in her perfumed rituals. As long as her image remained unspoiled, she could continue to rule, her face, her body, untouched by the passage of time. This section will focus on Elizabeth's profound fear of aging and how it influenced her decision to avoid water and bathing, opting instead for fabric-based rituals and fragrant oils to maintain her youthful appearance. It underscores how deeply personal insecurities shaped her public persona, with her image of eternal youth becoming a central pillar of her reign. Queen Elizabeth's obsession with sugar wasn't just a preference for sweet treats, it was a symbol of wealth, power, and status. In the 1500s, sugar was a rare commodity. Imported from distant lands, it was so expensive that only the richest and most influential could afford it. For Elizabeth, sugar became more than just a luxury. It was an essential part of her royal image, an indulgence that served as both a personal pleasure and a public statement. Her diet was filled with sugar-laden delights, candied fruits, marzipan, sugar-coated violets, and other sugary confections that dazzled the royal court. For Elizabeth, sugar was a mark of distinction, a way to flaunt the growing wealth and power of England. The more sugar she consumed, the more it signaled England's prosperity and her own ability to indulge in the finest luxuries. Sugar wasn't just a treat for her, it was an extension of her royal identity. But this royal obsession had a darker side. During Elizabeth's time, dental care was primitive at best. Toothbrushes were rough, and many people cleaned their teeth with twigs, rags, or crushed eggshells. The Queen, however, had access to the best apothecaries and medical professionals, so she didn't resort to such rudimentary methods. Instead, she had her own special formula, a homemade toothpaste composed of sugar and herbs. Yes, sugar, one of the very things rotting her teeth, was also what she used to clean them. Elizabeth's dental health was a direct consequence of her sugar obsession. As she consumed vast amounts of sweet treats and used sugar in her homemade toothpaste, the sugar clung to her teeth, contributing to severe decay. And yet the Queen didn't seem to notice, or at least she didn't allow it to interfere with her public image. The excess of sugar, combined with the lack of proper dental hygiene, eventually took its toll, leaving Elizabeth with blackened, broken, and decaying teeth. As early as the 1590s, foreign visitors to her court were struck by the state of her teeth. Her breath became so foul that it caused discomfort among those around her. At court, people began to whisper that the Queen's smile had become something grotesque, a shocking contrast to the flawless face she worked so hard to maintain. Yet despite the visible signs of decay, Elizabeth refused to allow her teeth to be treated. She was known to be stubborn and terrified of pain, and perhaps even more so, she was terrified of what would happen if her image was shattered. Her teeth became a reflection of her contradictions. On the outside, she was the pristine virgin queen, untouched by time and imperfection. But behind the facade, her body was falling apart, and the symptoms of her excesses were beginning to show. Still, she continued to wear a smile that concealed the truth. She resisted doctors who suggested pulling her teeth out, even though it was clear that the rot was damaging her health. To convince her of the dangers, one of her courtiers volunteered to have a tooth pulled in front of her, screaming in agony as a way to show Elizabeth the extreme consequences of neglecting her teeth. It was a deeply ironic twist. Elizabeth, the Queen of England, symbolizing power and strength, was unwilling to confront the physical reality of her own decay. Her refusal to acknowledge the truth about her health and her image became the ultimate form of denial. The sugar addiction that symbolized her wealth and status was slowly eroding her health and, in the end, her royal smile. This part focuses on Elizabeth's sugar addiction, illustrating how her obsession with the sweet substance was tied to her desire for status and luxury, and how it ultimately led to the severe deterioration of her teeth. The impact on her dental health and her refusal to confront the consequences of her indulgence adds a layer of tragedy and irony to her character. Her image, once so carefully constructed, was beginning to show signs of cracking. By the 1590s, Queen Elizabeth I's teeth were no longer a symbol of beauty or power. They had become a symbol of the Queen's refusal to acknowledge the reality of her aging body. Despite her carefully crafted image as the Virgin Queen, her dental health had deteriorated to such an extent that her once magnificent smile was now grotesque. The decay was not just a physical ailment, it was a silent testimony to the unsustainable nature of Elizabeth's obsession with perfection. For years, Elizabeth had consumed sugar in vast quantities, using it not only to indulge in sweet confections, but as part of her elaborate beauty rituals. Her homemade toothpaste, composed of sugar and herbs, was ironically one of the very things that contributed to the destruction of her teeth. The sugar that once symbolized England's wealth was now the cause of her teeth's rot. However, Elizabeth's vanity and fear of aging led her to continue using this toxic concoction, despite the obvious consequences. Her teeth, once as dazzling as her regal persona, began to rot and blacken. Visitors to the court were often taken aback by the state of her mouth, describing her breath as foul and her smile as alarming. But Elizabeth, always proud and unwilling to accept the decay of her image, refused to take any measures to remedy the situation. She resisted the advice of her doctors, who suggested pulling her decaying teeth, and instead chose to live with the visible decay. The Queen, known for her stubbornness, was terrified of the pain that dental procedures might cause, and more importantly, the pain of confronting the truth about her body's deterioration. Despite the damage to her teeth, Elizabeth's vanity demanded that she maintain a public persona that was perfect, untarnished by age or decay. As her smile worsened, her courtiers and the people around her had to confront a difficult reality. The Queen, the symbol of England's power and strength, was deteriorating before their eyes. Her physical body was failing her, but her image, what she had worked so hard to craft, had to remain flawless. In an ironic twist, Elizabeth's court, fascinated by her image, began to mimic her deteriorating smile. The ladies of the court, in an attempt to show their loyalty and status, started to blacken their own teeth using soot and charcoal, copying the Queen's condition. What had once been a sign of rot and decline became, in the world of Elizabethan fashion, a symbol of aristocracy and wealth. If the Queen's teeth were black, then surely black teeth were a mark of power. This bizarre trend among her courtiers is a testament to the extent to which Elizabeth's influence reached. Her decaying teeth, once a source of embarrassment, had now become a fashion statement. The Queen's image had transformed from that of a young, vibrant monarch to one whose very imperfections were now seen as desirable. Even tooth decay, in the strange world of the Elizabethan court, became a symbol of high status and class. But the irony of this situation was not lost on Elizabeth herself. She had worked tirelessly to craft an image of purity and perfection, to be the flawless virgin queen, untouched by time and age. Yet in the end, it was her own body, the very thing she worked so hard to protect, that betrayed her. Her teeth, once a shining part of her royal smile, had become a sign of her vulnerability. She could no longer hide the truth of her declining health, but her court and her people, loyal to her image, clung to the illusion. This section explores the severe deterioration of Elizabeth's teeth due to her sugar addiction and lack of proper dental care. The painful irony of her decaying smile, her refusal to confront the truth, and the bizarre way her court adopted her tooth decay as a symbol of status all serve to highlight the tragic and strange lengths Elizabeth went to in order to preserve her image. Despite the rot beneath the surface, her influence over her court and her image remained unchallenged. As the years wore on, Queen Elizabeth II's decaying teeth became more than just a private matter. They became a symbol of her extraordinary power and influence, albeit in a twisted form. In a world where appearance was everything, Elizabeth's image of eternal youth and beauty had begun to crack. And yet, this very imperfection was embraced by her court as a marker of status. Ironically, Elizabeth's tooth decay, once a sign of decline and vulnerability, became a coveted fashion statement. Her courtiers, eager to display their loyalty and elevate their own status, began to imitate her deteriorating smile. The once pristine teeth of England's queen had become a symbol of royal power. The women at her court, who had once aspired to emulate Elizabeth's flawless beauty, now took on the queen's dental affliction as a symbol of belonging to the highest echelons of society. They would blacken their teeth with soot or charcoal, mimicking the queen's rotten smile as a mark of distinction. The stranger the smile, the higher the status, an ironic reversal in the court's ever-changing standards of beauty. This development speaks volumes about the nature of Elizabeth's court and her control over not only politics, but also fashion and social norms. Elizabeth had so thoroughly crafted her public persona that even the decay of her body, an inevitable sign of mortality, was transformed into something aspirational. Her court, always eager to demonstrate their loyalty and emulate their queen, absorbed this strange trend, making it an essential part of their social fabric. But what did this mimicry say about the queen's influence? Even in the face of bodily decline, Elizabeth maintained her role as a trendsetter, a cultural leader whose image could shape the very nature of beauty in her time. She had succeeded in turning her greatest vulnerability into a symbol of superiority. Her decaying teeth, once seen as shameful, became emblematic of her power and control over the royal court. If the queen could suffer the ravages of time and still command respect, so too could her courtiers wear the mark of decay as a badge of honor. But in this process, Elizabeth's body had become a prison of its own making. The same image she had worked so hard to protect, the same facade of the untouchable Virgin Queen, was now undermined by the very things she had tried to keep hidden. Her health was failing, her teeth were rotting, and yet her reign, both symbolic and literal, continued to grow in influence. Her public image, immortal, ageless, and perfect, was still intact, but at a steep personal cost. As her courtiers began to emulate her decay, Elizabeth was faced with a profound paradox. She had spent her life building an image that was untouchable, impervious to time and frailty. But in the process, she had come to embody the very things she feared most: decay, imperfection, and mortality. The Queen's greatest asset, her power over her image, had begun to betray her, creating an unintentional spectacle of rot and vanity. This section delves deeper into the strange trend of tooth decay becoming fashionable at Elizabeth's court and highlights the extent of her influence over her courtiers, who mimicked her imperfections to display status. It also emphasizes the tragic irony of Elizabeth's situation. Despite her decaying health, her image remained powerful, and she inadvertently turned her own bodily decline into a mark of royal power. It reflects the paradox of a queen whose image was everything, even as the truth of her mortality slowly seeped through the cracks. In the world of Elizabeth Fernstern, cleanliness was not about health, it was about appearance. The Queen's idea of cleanliness was far removed from the modern conception of hygiene. It was a carefully crafted performance designed to preserve her image as an ageless, untouchable monarch. For Elizabeth, hygiene was not a matter of staying healthy. It was a matter of maintaining power, perfection, and divine status. In the 1500s, bathing was seen with suspicion. The prevalent belief was that water could carry disease and make the body weak. At the time, there was a widespread fear of miasma, an invisible poison in the air that was thought to cause illness. This belief was so entrenched that many people, including the Queen, considered water a dangerous element that should be avoided. While the general public might bathe infrequently, the monarch's refusal to immerse herself in water was not simply due to superstition, it was also a political statement. Elizabeth had to remain above the common practices, untouched by the ordinary rituals of her subjects. Her fear of water and the associated risks led her to adopt a more elaborate method of cleanliness, one that was as much about control and ritual as it was about personal care. Rather than bathing, Elizabeth would change her linen shifts multiple times a day. These shifts, made of fine fabric, were believed to draw impurities from the skin and were seen as the ultimate method of cleanliness. Every time Elizabeth donned a fresh shift, it was an outward display of purity and perfection. These changes, sometimes occurring several times daily, were her substitute for a bath, a ritual of preservation and performance rather than hygiene. But this process was not done on a whim. It was a deliberate and carefully executed ritual. Elizabeth's royal apothecaries concocted fragrant waters, including rose water and vinegar, which were dabbed onto her skin by handmaids. This was not a cleansing act in the sense we know today, but anointing her body with scented oils and potions that created the illusion of cleanliness. The act was slow, deliberate, and meticulous. It wasn't about removing dirt, it was about reinforcing the image of purity and control. This elaborate ritual was a performance, one that required time, effort, and numerous attendants to execute. For Elizabeth, the act of cleanliness was far more than a matter of hygiene. It was about building and maintaining a carefully constructed image of perfection. Her body was not merely a human vessel, it was a sacred object to be preserved at all costs. Every touch, every change of linen, every dab of rose water was designed to preserve her illusion of eternal youth, to keep her body as pristine as her public image. This performance of cleanliness extended beyond the queen herself. Her courtiers, too, adopted similar rituals to maintain the royal image. Fresh linens, fragrant oils, and perfumes were all part of the larger spectacle of Elizabeth's court. To be in the Queen's presence was to be part of a world that smelled of roses, lavender, and exotic herbs. There was no room for the reality of human scent or the imperfection of the body. Elizabeth's court was a realm of fragrance and illusion, where cleanliness was more about appearance than substance. In this section, we dive into the specific rituals Elizabeth adhered to in order to maintain the appearance of cleanliness. From the repeated changing of linen shifts to the careful application of fragrant waters, these rituals serve as a reflection of the Queen's obsession with her image and her refusal to engage in practices that might reveal the truth of her aging body. The focus here is not on hygiene in the traditional sense, but on the performance of cleanliness as an integral part of Elizabeth's royal persona. The complexity and ritualistic nature of her methods highlight the lengths to which she went to preserve her image as an ageless, untouchable monarch. Despite the extravagant rituals surrounding cleanliness at the Elizabethan court, one thing was clear: bathing was not a part of Queen Elizabeth I's life. The very idea of water touching her skin was not just taboo, it was seen as potentially dangerous. To understand the Queen's aversion to bathing, one must first consider the broader beliefs of her time about water and its association with illness. In the 1500s, bathing was a rare and sometimes controversial practice. People believed that water could open the pores and allow harmful miasmas, poisons in the air, to enter the body. This belief was rooted in the fear of plague and disease, which was rampant during the period. For Elizabeth, a monarch who needed to maintain an image of divinity and purity, exposing herself to water, and by extension, the vulnerability of the human body, was anathema. To bathe was to acknowledge the reality of the human body, with all its frailties and imperfections. And for a queen like Elizabeth, who had worked so hard to create an immortal image, admitting vulnerability was simply not an option. Moreover, bathing in the 16th century was not a simple, accessible task. Palaces did not have plumbing, and a bath involved the use of large wooden tubs that had to be filled with dozens of buckets of water. This process required several servants to prepare and carry the water, and it could take hours to set up. The act of bathing, then, was not just inconvenient. It was a massive logistical undertaking, requiring significant time and effort. To many in the royal court, bathing was more of a ceremonial affair, something done on rare occasions rather than a regular habit. For Elizabeth, bathing in such a manner would have been viewed as an inconvenience, a disruption to her carefully crafted daily routines. Instead of indulging in the ritual of a full bath, Elizabeth preferred to rely on her elaborate system of linen shifts and fragrant oils to maintain the illusion of cleanliness. This system allowed her to avoid the discomfort and risk of water while keeping up appearances. Changing into fresh linen shifts, sometimes several times a day, was not just a practical way to stay clean by the standards of her time. It was a method of ensuring that no trace of sweat, dirt, or oil marred her skin or disrupted her image. The application of rose water, vinegar, and other herbal infusions was more than a ritual of refreshment. It was a performance to ensure that the Queen's body, in all its delicate majesty, remained pristine and untouched by the physical realities of aging and time. While the rest of her court may have adhered to these similar customs, they were more likely to bathe on occasion, something that remained out of Elizabeth's reach. The message was clear. Water was dangerous, and so was acknowledging one's mortality. In the world of the Elizabethan elite, the Queen's refusal to bathe became a powerful statement. She didn't need water to stay clean. She was above such human needs. She had created an alternate reality in which her body was as untouched and pure as the legend she embodied. This part reveals how Elizabeth's avoidance of water was rooted in both superstition and practicality. The refusal to bathe, combined with her elaborate daily rituals, highlights the contrast between the realities of personal hygiene in her time and the carefully crafted image she worked so hard to maintain. Her avoidance of water is framed not just as a quirk, but as a deliberate rejection of vulnerability, symbolizing her larger strategy of preserving the myth of eternal youth and divine purity. It also underscores the lengths to which Elizabeth went to avoid revealing the physical decay that threatened her legendary image. Queen Elizabeth I's iconic appearance was defined by one thing above all: her face. Her porcelain-like skin, with its flawless white complexion, became the ultimate symbol of her power, wealth, and divine favor. But this seemingly perfect face was not entirely her own. It was a mask, an elaborate creation built from layers of makeup that not only obscured her natural skin, but also slowly poisoned her. Elizabeth's obsession with her appearance reached its zenith with the use of Venetian suze, a deadly concoction of white lead and vinegar that she applied to her face every day. In the 16th century, pale skin was not just a sign of beauty, it symbolized wealth, purity, and class. It was a visual representation of the ruling elite's separation from the common masses. For Elizabeth, this was more than a fashion statement. It was a deliberate act of maintaining her divine status. The Queen's face was meant to reflect not just beauty, but power. The paleness of her skin symbolized her connection to the heavens, her distance from the earthly struggles of ordinary people, and her authority over her kingdom. She was, in every sense, the Virgin Queen, untouched, unspoiled, and ageless. But the price for this flawless appearance was steep. Venetian suze, the substance Elizabeth favored, was a toxic mix of white lead and vinegar. The lead was intended to create the porcelain-like smoothness that Elizabeth desired, but over time it caused her skin to become irritated, inflamed, and scarred. Elizabeth's face, once bright and youthful, was slowly being eaten away by the very makeup she applied to preserve it. Yet she continued to apply it day after day, unwilling to relinquish the mask that had become synonymous with her royal identity. The pain and the long-term effects of the makeup were invisible to her subjects, and in her mind, they were worth the price of maintaining her untouchable image. As Elizabeth grew older, the damage caused by the lead became more visible. Her once flawless complexion began to deteriorate, with signs of rash and blistering appearing on her face. Yet the Queen's commitment to her image meant that she never stopped using the makeup, even as her skin became more damaged. The layers of white lead only grew thicker as Elizabeth's face became increasingly delicate and fragile. To those around her, it was said that the Queen's face was so fragile by her later years that even the slightest touch could cause the makeup to crack. She had become a prisoner of the very image she had built, locked in a cycle where her face was more important than her actual health. Elizabeth's obsession with her appearance didn't stop at her foundation. Her lips, too, were painted with a bright red color made from mercury, one of the most toxic substances known to man. The more she applied it, the more she poisoned herself. Mercury, like lead, has cumulative effects on the body, causing tremors, memory loss, and even death. The Queen's continued use of mercury in her makeup is a tragic reflection of the lengths she went to in order to preserve her image. She was willing to sacrifice her health, and perhaps even her life, to maintain the perfect face of the Virgin Queen, the symbol of eternal youth and power. This section delves into the dangerous, often self-destructive lengths Elizabeth went to in order to maintain the image of the Virgin Queen. Her reliance on toxic substances like Venetian suds and mercury highlights the paradox of her reign. The queen who wanted to be immortal, untouched by age and decay, was unknowingly poisoning herself with every application of her beauty products. It also reinforces the idea that Elizabeth's image was not just about beauty, it was about power. Her face, her appearance, became the most powerful tool in her arsenal, and she would stop at nothing to protect it, even at the cost of her own health. As Elizabeth I continued to apply her signature makeup, layer upon layer of white lead and red mercury, her health deteriorated in ways that were not immediately visible to her subjects. But the effects of these toxic substances were slowly and silently taking their toll on her body, causing long-term damage that would manifest over time. Mercury poisoning, which Elizabeth unknowingly subjected herself to every day through the use of her brightly colored lip paint, had severe consequences that went far beyond the cosmetic. Mercury, also known as quicksilver, is a powerful neurotoxin that affects the brain and nervous system. The cumulative effects of mercury exposure can lead to memory loss, cognitive decline, tremors, and even death in extreme cases. In Elizabeth's later years, her courtiers began to notice disturbing changes in her behavior and physical appearance. Her once sharp mind began to show signs of deterioration. She struggled with forgetfulness, and her hands sometimes trembled, betraying the slow poisoning that was ravaging her body. These symptoms were subtle at first, but they became more pronounced over time, raising concerns among those close to the Queen. Despite these changes, Elizabeth remained steadfast in her devotion to the mask of power that she had created. Her face had become a central part of her identity, her symbol of eternal youth, purity, and divinity. To acknowledge the damage to her health would have been to expose her vulnerability, something Elizabeth could never allow. Instead, she continued to pile on layers of makeup, perhaps unaware or unwilling to admit the long-term effects it was having on her body. The Queen's appearance, once a symbol of flawless beauty, had begun to betray her. Her face became more fragile with age, the skin beneath the makeup scarred and irritated. But it wasn't just the external damage that was visible. It was also the toll on her mental and physical health. The tremors in her hands and the forgetfulness were not just the ravages of age. They were the direct result of her toxic beauty regimen. Yet despite the clear signs of damage, Elizabeth remained devoted to the illusion of youth and perfection, unable to stop the process that was slowly consuming her. This section highlights the tragic irony of Elizabeth's situation. The very beauty she so carefully crafted and the image she worked so hard to preserve were in fact killing her. Mercury poisoning was a hidden cost of her obsession with perfection, a slow and silent killer that gradually robbed her of her health and her mental acuity. Her refusal to acknowledge the damage to her body, whether from her teeth or her makeup, reflects the deeper psychological toll of her reign. To Elizabeth, preserving her image as the Virgin Queen was worth any price, even if it meant sacrificing her own well-being. In this section, we see how Elizabeth's refusal to acknowledge her physical decline led to a slow deterioration of both her health and her mental faculties. The long-term effects of mercury poisoning are explored, emphasizing the tragedy of a queen who, in her quest for eternal youth, unknowingly destroyed the very thing she sought to preserve. It also adds a layer of emotional complexity to her character, showing how her vanity and fear of aging ultimately became her undoing. Queen Elizabeth I's face was not just her identity, it was her power. It was the mask she wore to symbolize not just beauty, but the invincibility of her reign. Her face represented the Virgin Queen, eternal, ageless, and untouched by time. To the people of England, Elizabeth's visage was as much a symbol of divine providence as it was of royal authority. But behind this flawless, porcelain-like mask was a woman who was desperately clinging to an illusion, terrified of losing the very thing that had made her both beloved and powerful. In the 16th century, an unblemished, pale complexion was a visual sign of nobility, wealth, and purity, and it became synonymous with royal power. For Elizabeth, this was more than just a beauty standard. It was a weapon. The perfection of her face was a direct extension of her rule. It embodied the image of a monarch who was beyond reproach, untouched by the ravages of age or mortality. But this carefully cultivated appearance was not achieved naturally. Elizabeth's reliance on layers of toxic makeup, like Venetian Suze, was her way of constructing a face that could never grow old, could never betray the physical frailties of time. But as the years passed, the cost of this obsession became more apparent. Beneath the white lead and mercury, Elizabeth's skin began to show signs of severe damage. The makeup, rather than enhancing her beauty, began to destroy the skin it was meant to perfect. Her complexion, once smooth and flawless, became scarred and blotchy. Beneath the layers of toxic substances, her skin was deteriorating. Yet Elizabeth continued to apply the makeup, convinced that her image was the key to her power. She had to maintain the illusion at all costs. Elizabeth's face became a symbol not just of royal authority, but of the dangers of vanity and self-deception. Her refusal to acknowledge the damage to her skin or the toll her beauty regimen was taking on her body was a reflection of her refusal to confront her own mortality. Her face was no longer just a symbol of power, it was a mask, a barrier between her public identity and the reality of her aging body. The illusion of perfection was so powerful that it was carefully preserved in portraits. Artists were instructed to portray the queen in a way that kept her appearance unchanged, no matter how old she became. The portraits were always youthful, always flawless. Her aging face was hidden from the world, and the image of a youthful, powerful monarch was maintained at all costs. This was not just vanity, it was a strategic decision. Elizabeth knew that her power lay in the perception of her strength, and to show weakness, to show aging, would have been to unravel the very image that had made her untouchable. In private, Elizabeth's face had become so delicate that her courtiers whispered that even the slightest touch could cause her makeup to crack. She had become so dependent on the mask that it had become a prison. The queen was no longer seen as a real woman, but as an image, a figure who could not age, could not show vulnerability, and could not be touched by time. It was as if the very face that had defined her reign was slowly consuming her, stripping her of the humanity she had tried so hard to keep hidden. This part delves into the symbolism of Elizabeth's face, which had become an embodiment of her power, and the lengths she went to in order to preserve the illusion of eternal youth and purity. The makeup and portraits that were meant to maintain her image as an ageless queen also became symbols of her self-deception and the eventual toll that her vanity took on her health. The Queen's face, once a powerful symbol of royal authority, had become a mask that both defined and imprisoned her. This section serves as a poignant reflection on the price of maintaining an untouchable image and the tragic consequences of clinging too tightly to a facade of perfection. As Elizabeth I entered her later years, the disparity between her public image and private reality became more pronounced. Her face, once a flawless emblem of royal power and eternal youth, was now a fragile mask, carefully constructed from layers of toxic makeup and meticulously designed portraits. The Queen had spent decades cultivating the perfect image, the Virgin Queen, forever untarnished by time, untouched by the human flaws that plagued the rest of her court. But as time wore on, the physical cost of this illusion became undeniable. Yet Elizabeth refused to allow her true self to be seen. The court of Elizabeth was a world built on appearances, where power was demonstrated through the presentation of the body. A queen as a symbol of divine authority was not meant to show signs of weakness, vulnerability, or age. This was why Elizabeth's face became so crucial to her reign. It was her strongest weapon, the ultimate symbol of her unyielding power. And yet it was also a source of profound vulnerability. Beneath the layers of white lead, her skin was scarred and blotchy, ravaged by the very makeup meant to preserve her. Beneath the portraits, her real face, now fragile and damaged, was something she refused to confront. Elizabeth had gone to great lengths to ensure her appearance was flawless for the world to see, but in her private rooms, she was surrounded by mirrors that told a different story. Her face was so delicate by her final years that she forbade mirrors from her chambers. No one, not even her closest confidants, was allowed to see her without her mask. The idea of being seen without her carefully painted face was unthinkable. To face the reality of her aging, deteriorating body was to acknowledge that the legend she had built was slowly fading away. Elizabeth's obsession with her image was not limited to the external world. It was a deeply personal obsession. Her entire identity had become entwined with her appearance, and she was unable to separate the two. She had become a prisoner of her own image, trapped in a cycle of denial that refused to let her face the truth of her body's decline. Her refusal to allow others to see her real face was not just about vanity, it was about maintaining control over her own narrative. She could not allow herself to be seen as vulnerable, as mortal. In her mind, doing so would destroy the carefully crafted myth of the Virgin Queen, the eternal symbol of power and invincibility. The layers of makeup she applied were not just about enhancing her beauty, they were about preserving a myth. The face she presented to the world was a work of art, a constructed version of herself that was designed to hide the reality beneath. But over time, that mask became heavier, more fragile, and more dangerous. The makeup, which was meant to preserve her image, was slowly poisoning her. It was a cruel irony. What had once been a symbol of beauty and power had now become a source of illness and decay. Elizabeth's obsession with maintaining this image went beyond vanity. It was an act of survival. In a world where a woman's strength could be easily destroyed by the slightest hint of weakness, Elizabeth had built an impenetrable armor around herself. But as the years passed, that armor became less and less effective, and the reality of her aging body became harder to hide. Her image, which had been her greatest strength, was now her greatest vulnerability. This section delves into the psychological and emotional toll, Elizabeth's obsession with her image took on her. The refusal to confront the reality of her aging body, the denial of mirrors, and the constant application of makeup all serve as metaphors for the larger illusion she built around herself. The mask of perfection that had defined her reign had become a burden, a prison that kept her from acknowledging the truth. The queen's greatest fear was not death, but the loss of her untouchable, immortal image. In this way, her obsession with maintaining her appearance ultimately consumed her, leaving her trapped in a world of illusion. For Queen Elizabeth I, cleanliness was not about hygiene, but about creating and maintaining the perfect illusion. Her daily rituals were elaborate performances that served to enhance her image as the untouchable Virgin Queen, above the mundane concerns of the body. Yet these rituals were more than just vanity. They were rooted in her fear of aging, of losing her power, and of exposing her true mortal self to the world. The irony of Elizabeth's approach to cleanliness lay in the fact that, while she obsessed over appearing spotless and pristine, the actual health benefits of cleanliness were often sacrificed for the sake of her image. In the 1500s, the concept of cleanliness was vastly different from modern hygiene. People bathed infrequently, with water being seen as dangerous and potentially disease-ridden. Elizabeth, like many of her contemporaries, adhered to the belief that water could bring sickness, particularly the invisible miasmas that were thought to cause disease. For the Queen, exposing her body to water was unthinkable. She saw it not just as a personal risk, but as a symbolic surrender to the physicality of the human body, a body she sought to keep untarnished by time and decay. Instead of bathing, Elizabeth relied on a series of carefully crafted rituals to maintain the appearance of cleanliness. She changed her linen shifts multiple times a day. This was not just about removing sweat and dirt, but about keeping up the appearance of purity. Her court believed that fresh fabric could absorb impurities from the skin, creating an illusion of cleanliness without the need for water. When Elizabeth did use water, it was usually in the form of fragrant rose water or vinegar, dabbed onto her skin by handmaids. These treatments weren't about hygiene. They were about scent, about maintaining the illusion of freshness and purity that was central to her royal image. But these rituals also had a darker side. Elizabeth's obsession with her image and the lengths she went to preserve it often meant sacrificing her health. Her reliance on toxic beauty products like Venetian Suze, a mix of white lead and vinegar, meant that her skin was slowly being poisoned as she desperately tried to maintain her porcelain-like appearance. Her reluctance to engage in the normal practices of bathing and cleaning her body reflected her desire to stay in control of how the world saw her, but it also meant that her physical well-being was compromised. The irony is that her attempts to protect herself from the ravages of time through superficial rituals ended up having the opposite effect, destroying her health in ways she could not have foreseen. The Queen's refusal to embrace cleanliness in its most basic form, to wash away the dirt and sweat of the day, was not just about avoiding water, it was about maintaining control over the narrative of her own body. She did not want to acknowledge that she was a human being, subject to the same frailties as anyone else. Instead, she built a performance of cleanliness, one that kept her image intact, even as her body quietly betrayed her. This section emphasizes the contrast between Elizabeth's obsessive rituals of cleanliness and the actual benefits of hygiene. While her efforts to maintain a flawless image led to dangerous consequences, they were also a reflection of her desire to control the perception of her body and her reign. The rituals, which should have been about health, were instead a means of survival in the courtly world of power and image. By avoiding the basic necessity of water, Elizabeth preserved the illusion of purity, but at a great cost to her own health. The true irony of her approach to cleanliness is that, in her effort to preserve her image as untouchable and eternal, she allowed herself to be consumed by the very illusion she had created. In Elizabeth I's world, the scent of power was not just about luxury, it was about control. The Queen's use of perfumes and fragrances was another carefully crafted layer in her performance of purity, refinement, and royal authority. Her reliance on sweet-smelling concoctions, however, was not just a matter of personal preference. It was a strategic move to create a controlled and untouchable environment around her. Elizabeth was determined to ensure that the world around her always smelled like roses, lavender, and exotic spices, reinforcing the image of a queen who existed above the common realities of decay, sweat, and the human condition. Scent played an important role in the cultural and social landscape of the time. In an era without modern sanitation, perfumes were often used to mask unpleasant odors that arose from the lack of regular bathing and proper waste management. For Elizabeth, however, perfumes were not just practical, they were an essential part of her royal image. Her court was perfumed with an array of fragrant oils, rose water, and incense, creating an environment that felt divine and otherworldly. To be in the Queen's presence was to be enveloped in the heady mix of fragrances that signified both her wealth and her power. Elizabeth's love of perfume was not just a means of masking bodily odors. It was an extension of her image as the Virgin Queen. Fragrance was a powerful symbol of both cleanliness and purity. Her personal scent, carefully cultivated, became synonymous with her royal identity. To carry the fragrance of the Queen was to carry the scent of England itself, refined, controlled, and untainted by the roughness of the outside world. The Queen's personal attendants would prepare these fragrances with great care, ensuring that each scent added to the Queen's aura of invincibility. Yet this obsession with scent and the control it gave her over her environment had deeper implications. Elizabeth's use of perfumes was not just about hiding the unpleasant odors of the body, it was about creating an illusion of perfection, one where the Queen could remain untouchable, beyond the physical limitations of mortality. The fragrances she surrounded herself with became a mask, just like the makeup she used to paint her face. Beneath the perfumes and the layers of scent, her body was slowly decaying, just as her skin was being destroyed by toxic makeup. But as long as she could maintain the illusion of a clean, divine queen, her power would remain intact. Elizabeth even took this obsession with scent further. She carried pomanders, small ornate balls filled with herbs and resins, in her gowns or on her belt. These delicate items allowed her to control the air around her, blocking any unpleasant smells from reaching her. They were not just practical, they were another layer of royal symbolism, a constant reminder that the Queen was a figure above the common concerns of the world. In many ways, Elizabeth's use of perfume was an extension of her image management. Just as she avoided water and created rituals around her cleanliness, she used fragrance to build an atmosphere where nothing could threaten her divine image. She was the Queen, the symbol of England, and nothing could disturb the perfect aura she had so carefully created. But the perfumes also reflected a deeper psychological need. Elizabeth's reliance on fragrance was not just about creating the illusion of purity, it was about reinforcing her own sense of control. In a world where physical decay was inevitable, the queen used scent to remind herself and those around her that she was not like the ordinary people. She was above the common decay of the human body, wrapped in a cloak of sweetness and refinement that would allow her to transcend the inevitability of aging and death. This section examines Elizabeth's obsession with perfumes and the use of scent as a strategic means of preserving her image. It explores how scent, much like her makeup and rituals, became a tool for control and illusion. The perfumes were more than just a mask. They were an essential part of the Queen's strategy to maintain an untouchable, divine image and to shield herself from the physical realities of her aging body. In many ways, the Queen's reliance on scent symbolizes her ultimate desire to preserve her image, regardless of the cost. As Elizabeth I entered her later years, maintaining her image became increasingly difficult. The ravages of age and the toll of her toxic beauty regimen were beginning to show on her real body. To preserve the illusion of the untouchable Virgin Queen, Elizabeth turned to wigs and powders to maintain her image of flawless beauty and youth. Her real hair, thinning and likely damaged by the years of toxic makeup and mercury, was now hidden beneath carefully crafted wigs. These wigs, often powdered with white or pale hues, allowed her to maintain her regal appearance while hiding the physical decline beneath. Wigs were not just a practical solution. They were part of the Queen's carefully constructed royal persona. Elizabeth's court was well aware of the importance of maintaining appearances, and the Queen's hair was no exception. It had to be full, thick, and regal, an image of strength and vitality. But her thinning natural hair could no longer support this ideal, so Elizabeth resorted to wigs, particularly those made from fine, imported hair. The wigs became part of the ritual of maintaining the royal appearance, a seamless extension of the Queen's carefully curated image. To ensure that her wigs were as perfect as her public persona, Elizabeth's attendants would carefully dress and powder them. This process, which involved coating her hair with a mix of white powder and starch, helped to achieve the pale, ageless look that she desired. The powder served not only to hide the imperfections of her natural hair, but also to maintain the image of porcelain purity that defined her reign. The powdered wigs added to the overall sense of artificiality and control that Elizabeth maintained over her appearance. This use of wigs and powders is another manifestation of Elizabeth's obsession with creating an image that could not be touched by time. Her reliance on these artificial elements, like the makeup, wigs, and perfumes, became a way to hide the truths of her aging body and deteriorating health. The powdered wig in particular symbolized Elizabeth's desire to create a mask, a visual shield that kept the inevitable signs of aging at bay. Yet, as with all her rituals, the disguise could only hold the truth at bay for so long. The more she relied on these external elements, the further she distanced herself from the reality of her body's decline. As Elizabeth grew older, the pressure to maintain her image intensified. Her once vibrant appearance, which had captivated her court and solidified her authority, was now a fragile construct. The wigs and powders were no longer just about vanity, they were part of a larger strategy to maintain power. The Queen knew that her image was inseparable from her reign. To be seen as aging or frail was to risk undermining the authority that her youthful appearance had solidified. Thus, she relied on the wigs and powders as a part of a carefully managed illusion, one that ensured the world saw her as the immortal queen, untouched by time. This section explores the role of wigs and powder in Elizabeth's image management, emphasizing how her reliance on these artificial elements became a critical part of her performance as the Virgin Queen. It highlights the lengths she went to in order to hide the natural signs of aging and preserve the illusion of eternal youth. These strategies, like the makeup and perfumes, reflect Elizabeth's profound fear of mortality and the lengths she was willing to go to in order to maintain her royal power. Despite the artificiality of her appearance, Elizabeth's reliance on wigs and powders symbolizes her ultimate desire to remain untouchable, even as her body continued to betray her. Despite the extraordinary efforts Queen Elizabeth I put into maintaining her appearance, the toll on her body was undeniable. Years of reliance on toxic beauty products, wigs, powders, and perfumes to craft an ageless image began to catch up with her. The very rituals that kept her royal persona intact were slowly and silently damaging her health. Elizabeth had created a mask of eternal youth, but beneath it her body was crumbling, ravaged by lead, mercury, and the physical strain of keeping up the facade of perfection. The Queen's skin, constantly coated with white lead and other toxic substances, became increasingly delicate and sensitive. It developed sores, rashes, and blisters, evidence of the damage caused by years of mercury and lead exposure. Her face, once smooth and radiant, was now scarred, and the makeup she so carefully applied was no longer able to hide the toll of her self-destructive beauty regimen. In fact, it seemed to magnify the damage, as the more she applied, the worse her condition became. Physically, Elizabeth was deteriorating. Her hands trembled, a sign of mercury poisoning, and her mental sharpness, once one of her most admired traits, began to falter. The Queen's fear of aging and her obsession with maintaining the image of perfection had pushed her to ignore the warnings her body was giving her. Her reliance on poisonous substances and artificial enhancements ultimately took its toll, leaving her fragile, weakened, and unable to fully engage with the world around her. The mental decline that accompanied her physical deterioration was perhaps the most devastating. Elizabeth, whose wit and intelligence had once been the bedrock of her reign, struggled with memory loss and confusion. The mercury, which had poisoned her body for years through her makeup, slowly eroded her cognitive abilities. Her once sharp mind, revered by courtiers and foreign dignitaries alike, became clouded and unreliable. Despite these troubling signs, Elizabeth continued to cling to the illusion that she was ageless and invincible. Her need to preserve the appearance of power and purity outweighed the reality of her failing health. She refused to allow her image to falter, even as her body betrayed her. Her court, ever loyal and eager to maintain the illusion, did everything in their power to support the Queen's image, often hiding the signs of her decline from the public. In private, Elizabeth's physical decline was more evident. She had become so frail that even the simplest tasks, like applying makeup or adjusting her wig, required the help of her attendants. Yet she continued to embrace the rituals of beauty and power, clinging to them as a lifeline. It was a tragic irony. Her efforts to preserve her image had, in fact, contributed to her physical and mental downfall. This section examines the high cost of Elizabeth's obsession with perfection and the toll it took on her body. Her physical decline, compounded by mercury and lead poisoning, is juxtaposed with her desperate need to maintain the image of the Virgin Queen. Elizabeth's reliance on artificial enhancements, wigs, makeup, and perfumes ultimately led to her deterioration, both mentally and physically. The Queen's story is a tragic reminder of the dangers of clinging too tightly to an illusion and the devastating consequences of sacrificing one's health for the sake of an untouchable image. As Queen Elizabeth I's health declined, her world grew smaller and more isolated. Her reliance on the performance of power through her appearance meant that the public image of the Queen had to remain flawless, untarnished by time, decay, or vulnerability. To maintain this image, Elizabeth retreated further from the reality of her physical and mental decline. Her court, loyal and complicit in maintaining the illusion, helped shield her from the truth. In her final years, Elizabeth's once thriving court became a place of secrecy. She became increasingly dependent on her attendants and advisors to help maintain her appearance. While the Queen's political influence remained immense, her personal engagement with the world around her began to wane. She became more withdrawn, her energy waning as she focused more on managing her image than on ruling her kingdom. Her body had become a prison, a fragile, deteriorating vessel encased in layers of makeup, wigs, and fragrances, and it was becoming harder and harder to conceal the signs of her decay. Elizabeth's court had long been a place of intrigue and grandeur, where courtiers vied for favor, each hoping to catch a glimpse of the Queen's flawless image. But now, the Queen's presence was a carefully controlled spectacle. The royal chambers were lit by candlelight, casting shadows that hid the true state of Elizabeth's face. The carefully applied makeup, the powdered wigs, and the fragrances that enveloped her were all meant to create the illusion of eternal youth. She refused to be seen in natural light, fearing it would reveal the cracks in her mask. Even the most loyal members of her court were not allowed to see her without the carefully crafted layers that defined her public persona. In private, the Queen had become a shell of the formidable monarch who had once commanded the world's attention. Her servants, tasked with applying her makeup, adjusting her wigs, and preparing her clothes, saw the toll that the years had taken on her body. She had become so frail that some sources suggest she could no longer dress herself or perform many of the basic tasks required of a queen. Her body, once full of vitality, had now become a vessel for an image that was no longer sustainable. The isolation wasn't just physical. Elizabeth's mental state also deteriorated, and as her cognitive functions declined, so did her ability to engage in the world around her. Once sharp, her mind became clouded with forgetfulness and confusion. The mercury poisoning that had ravaged her body for years now took its toll on her mental faculties, leaving her unable to rule with the same clarity and control she once had. Yet despite these signs of frailty, she remained the symbol of England's power and strength. To show weakness was unthinkable. To be seen as vulnerable or mortal was a threat to the very foundation of her reign. Her court did what they could to shield her from the outside world. They continued to speak of her as the untouchable Virgin Queen, the eternal symbol of England's greatness. But behind the mask, the truth was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Elizabeth's physical decline had become a closely guarded secret, her frailty hidden behind a veil of artificial beauty and power. She had become a prisoner of her own image, trapped in a world where maintaining the illusion was more important than facing the truth of her condition. This section explores the deepening isolation of Queen Elizabeth in her final years, as her reliance on her carefully curated image grew stronger and her personal decline became more evident. The court's complicity in maintaining the illusion of a perfect queen contrasts with the reality of Elizabeth's frailty, both physical and mental. Her image, which had once been her greatest strength, had now become a prison that kept her from acknowledging the truth. The tragedy lies in the fact that Elizabeth, once the most powerful woman in the world, had become trapped in her own image, unable, or unwilling to confront the inevitable decay of her body and mind. Behind the magnificent walls of Elizabeth's palaces, where silk carpets lined the floors and gold ceilings glimmered in candlelight, the reality of royal life was far less glamorous. While Elizabeth herself meticulously crafted the image of cleanliness and purity, her palace was a different world entirely. The lack of modern plumbing and sanitation created a world of filth, decay, and uncomfortable truths. For all her focus on her appearance and the illusion of a perfect royal image, Elizabeth, like all of her contemporaries, was forced to live in a place where hygiene was a rare luxury. There were no flushing toilets, no sinks, no running water. The Queen's most private toilet was a wooden chair called a close stool. It looked regal on the outside, but beneath the cushion was a simple ceramic pot that collected waste. The idea of privacy and dignity in such moments was an illusion, with servants required to attend to the task of emptying, cleaning, and even perfuming the chamber pot. The close stool was not just a piece of furniture. It was a symbol of the court's struggle to maintain the veneer of nobility and cleanliness in an environment that was, in many ways, unsanitary and overcrowded. The job of emptying the waste didn't fall to ordinary servants, but to the groom of the stool, a high-ranking, trusted noble who had the difficult and unpleasant task of attending to the Queen's most intimate needs. This position was considered one of the highest honors in the royal household, as it granted close access to the Queen. The groom of the stool was more than just a servant. He had the power to shape royal matters, often advising the Queen on matters of state in moments of private intimacy. This strange, paradoxical relationship between royalty and the unclean tasks that were essential to the palace's functioning speaks to the complexity of Elizabeth's world. But beyond the close stool, the palace was a labyrinth of poor sanitation. There were no waste disposal systems, only chamber pots, buckets, and bowls used by everyone in the royal household. These were often dumped into cesspits, sometimes hidden beneath the floors or out in the courtyard, creating an environment steeped in the smell of human waste. The palace, with all its opulence and grandeur, was also a breeding ground for filth and disease. While Elizabeth focused on creating an image of perfection through her personal cleanliness rituals, the very air she breathed was contaminated with the stench of the kingdom's waste. The palace staff worked diligently to mask the smell, burning lavender, rosemary, and sweet marjoram to try to create a more pleasant atmosphere. Flowers were strewn on the floors and oils were poured onto the carpets, but the odor could never truly be erased. Even the richest fabrics, the most expensive perfumes, and the finest silks could not hide the truth. The palace was not the pristine, flawless realm the Queen projected to the outside world. It was a place of decay, dirt, and discomfort, a reflection of the larger contradictions in Elizabeth's life, the tension between the royal image she sought to protect and the unyielding reality of human nature. This section highlights the deep contrast between Elizabeth's personal hygiene rituals and the filthy conditions of the royal palace. While she focused on maintaining her image as a flawless monarch, the reality behind the palace walls was one of neglect and decay. The close stool, chamber pots, and cesspits serve as a reminder of the filth and disease that existed even in the most powerful and majestic spaces. The Queen's court was a reflection of this paradox, one that was always striving for cleanliness and purity, yet inextricably tied to the decay and imperfection that lay just beneath the surface. In a world of royal grandeur, where power was defined by the perfection of the monarch's image, Elizabeth I's court became a carefully curated environment where scent played a key role in preserving the queen's untouchable image. The use of perfumes, incense, and fragrant oils was not just about masking unpleasant odors, but about creating an atmosphere that reinforced Elizabeth's power and presence. The Queen's court was a world that smelled of roses, lavender, and exotic spices, fragrances that suggested purity, refinement, and divine grace, masking the reality of the palace's uncleanliness. Elizabeth herself was rarely without her signature scent. Her personal fragrances, which she applied in abundance, were symbolic of her image as a monarch untouched by time and mortality. The perfumes were an extension of her royal aura, sending a message to those around her. She was not like the rest of the world. She did not smell like common people, and she did not share their vulnerabilities. The scent that surrounded Elizabeth was a barrier between her and the rest of humanity, an invisible shield that kept her elevated above the ordinary world. The perfumes and fragrances were carefully prepared by royal apothecaries who blended rare oils and flowers into potions that would be used to anoint the queen's skin. Rosewater, lavender, and citrus were just a few of the scents Elizabeth wore to project an image of purity and cleanliness. Her attendants would dab these fragrant liquids onto her skin as part of her daily ritual, ensuring she always smelled like the divine ruler she presented herself to be. But the court's obsession with scent went beyond the queen herself. Perfume and incense were used throughout the palace to create a sensory environment that supported the illusion of royalty. The air was filled with aromatic fragrances, masking the smell of the common people, the servants, and the decaying parts of the palace. The fragrant oils and flower petals strewn across the floors served to keep the illusion intact, creating an environment where no unpleasant odor could seep through and shatter the image of divine cleanliness. The queen's courtiers were expected to maintain this illusion as well. They too would wear perfume gloves, carry scented handkerchiefs, and sometimes even sprinkle their clothes with rosewater. The scent of power permeated the entire court, an invisible but ever-present reminder that those who surrounded the queen were part of an elevated world, a world where cleanliness, beauty, and purity were the norms. It was an image that was to be maintained at all costs, and Elizabeth's court was a place where those who served her were as much a part of the spectacle as the queen herself. However, despite the artificial fragrance that clung to everything, the reality was that this controlled, perfumed world was also one of contradictions. The palace itself, as we've seen, was a place of decay and filth, with chamber pots, open cesspits, and poor sanitation hidden beneath layers of fragrant oils and flower petals. The Queen's court, as meticulously curated as it was, had to coexist with the unpleasant truths of life. Despite the sweet perfumes and the luxurious fabrics, the underlying stench of decay and human waste was never truly erased. Elizabeth's obsession with creating the illusion of perfection in her court and in herself was constantly at odds with the reality of her world. This section highlights how scent was used to reinforce the image of power and purity at Elizabeth's court, and how it served as an integral part of her royal persona. The contrast between the artificial fragrance that permeated the palace and the reality of the palace's poor sanitation underscores the contradiction in Elizabeth's life. Her public image of cleanliness and invincibility versus the underlying decay of both her physical body and the royal environment. The use of perfume and scent in the royal court becomes a metaphor for Elizabeth's reign itself, a constant performance that was designed to hide the truth and preserve the image of eternal youth and power. As Queen Elizabeth I's reign drew to a close, her legacy was one of unmatched power, cultural flourishing, and, paradoxically, deep personal sacrifice. The Queen's image, which had been meticulously constructed and preserved throughout her life, was her most powerful weapon. It was the symbol of England's strength, unity, and divine favor, and it was the key to her political success. Yet beneath the flawless image, Elizabeth was a woman who had spent her entire life running from the reality of aging, decay, and mortality. She had sacrificed her health and her humanity to maintain the illusion of eternal youth and divine power. In her final years, Elizabeth's image became a tool not only for her own preservation, but for the preservation of England itself. As her physical and mental health deteriorated, her image was all that remained. The portraits of her, which had been carefully commissioned to portray her as ageless and powerful, became the public face of England. These portraits, always youthful, always pristine, were meant to convey not just Elizabeth's beauty, but the strength of her nation. To maintain the myth of eternal youth was to maintain the myth of a kingdom that was vibrant, powerful, and unassailable. However, as her health failed and the years took their toll, Elizabeth became more reliant on her court to uphold the royal performance. Her advisors, her attendants, and even her courtiers worked tirelessly to maintain the illusion that she was still the powerful, untouchable monarch that the world had once revered. In private, the Queen's frailty became more evident. Yet in public, she remained a symbol of immortality. The Queen had become so disconnected from the reality of her own body that her image had become the only thing that mattered. To show the world the truth of her aging and decline would have shattered everything she had worked so hard to build. Elizabeth's image, painted, powdered, and perfumed, was not just a facade, it was her legacy. The Queen had spent decades constructing an image that could never be touched by time, decay, or the ordinary limitations of human existence. In this pursuit, she had forsaken her own health, her own humanity. The irony, of course, is that Elizabeth's greatest achievement, her image, was built on lies and denial. It was a mask that concealed not just her aging body, but the deeper fear of mortality that haunted her throughout her life. By the time of her death in 1603, Elizabeth's carefully crafted image had become so synonymous with England's identity that it transcended the Queen herself. The Virgin Queen was no longer just a woman, she was an icon, a symbol of England's glory and unyielding power. The image of the youthful Queen, untouched by time, would live on long after her death, becoming an integral part of England's national identity and history. But beneath the grandeur, behind the portraits, was a woman who had spent her entire life constructing a myth that would ultimately outlast her. Elizabeth I's legacy is a tragic reminder of the cost of maintaining an untouchable image. Her reign, marked by immense political and cultural achievements, was overshadowed by her relentless pursuit of perfection, even at the expense of her own well-being. The Queen, who had once been considered the embodiment of divine power, had become, in her final years, a symbol of what happens when image and reality are forced into a never-ending performance. In the end, Elizabeth's greatest legacy was not just the political and cultural achievements she left behind, but the image she constructed for herself, an image of eternal youth, invincibility, and power. It was a legacy built on the fragility of human life, yet one that transcended the reality of her existence. In a world where kings and queens were remembered for their deeds and their power, Elizabeth was remembered for something far more fleeting: the image of a queen who refused to let go of the myth she had created, even at the cost of her own life. This final section reflects on Elizabeth's lasting legacy, exploring how her carefully curated image, crafted through makeup, perfume, and performance, became more enduring than the queen herself. Her fear of aging and the lengths she went to maintain the illusion of perfection ultimately defined her reign and her legacy, making her an immortal figure in English history, even as she paid the price with her own health and humanity. The irony of Elizabeth's life is that her greatest triumph, the preservation of her image, was built on the rejection of the human reality she so desperately sought to avoid.